Okay, so this is just a continuation of the last slides on governing the firm, and then heading towards the sort of the wrapping up what we've learned in this workshop. Tomorrow is our last full day, and yeah, so we're going to have more time tomorrow also to work on your project. And so I think after this, there will be one more supplementary lecture. So for later, covering a few other things I haven't mentioned yet. And then tomorrow there will be this new synthesis, so continuing this final module. The first paper that I wanted to sort of summarize for you is by Simon Peck, who is a professor for business administration at Victoria University, also in Canada. And he's written a very interesting paper, 2019, on sortition, which you may not have actually even heard of that expression. Sortition is just another word for lottery. And so it's a tool for selecting. And in fact, it was used in ancient Athens and also in democracies around the Mediterranean. Oliver Dowland calls sortition a blind break, meaning it's a mechanism that actually destroys or prevents human judgment. So in that sense, it actually removes any types of, ideas that we might have, preconceptions, prejudices, things like discrimination. So even, again, making a selection, choosing in a group, what are the group dynamics of choice? In many cases, we have elections, and elections are prone to bias. So for instance, we have in our mind the image of a candidate who should be, elected. So in the end, elections sometimes result in suboptimal outcomes because they are influenced by our own perceptions of who is a better leader. So for instance, this might come to the detriment of women or minorities or somebody who might just, look or speak in a way that isn't deemed as professional or in whatever sense. So this ends up with very, professional looking politicians who maybe then in the end are not the best politicians. And a sortition removes that by actually rendering, the selection dependent on, statistical chance. In ancient Athens and other democracies, voting was actually restricted to a small set of strategic positions like military leaders. So where actually it was deemed very critical that the right person does get the job, because if you have somebody who's incompetent as your general, then there will be an invasion and you will lose. But besides those very few strategic positions, most other positions were allotted, so selected by lot, things like senators and justices in courts and similar positions. Today, actually, we still use sortition in many countries in legal and actually particularly in criminal trials when there's a jury selection. So, which is also done in a similar way using a random selection. So Simon Peck in this paper suggests that there actually has been very little or no serious consideration of the potential for lottery as a selection tool in organizations. So in fact, much of the literature is restricted to the political sphere, so political science and the study of juries. And his idea is that sortition in organizations, so for instance, selecting the board of an organization via lottery, could reduce the tendency towards oligarchy. So you have maybe one subclass of members in an organization that continually rotate the leadership position amongst themselves. This notion of a random selection or random lottery would eliminate that, just because everyone, or at least everyone who's in the pool, would be equally eligible. And of course, we can talk about, what makes someone eligible. So, the lottery can actually be determined. You can say, you have to be a certain age, You might have to have worked in the company for a certain amount of time. You might have to have certain skills. And within that subset of people who meet those criteria, then there's a random lottery. So that, of course, maybe could prevent, again, things like incompetence. So also it could improve the representation of decision making, meaning that the actual decisions that are made are basically representative of the views of the total membership of the firm, and not just a small class. He also suggests it could increase the attentiveness towards the broad workforce. So very similar point. Basically, having the board filled with lottery or selected members would, again, make the opinions of the board look more like the opinions of everyone else in the company. Also, he says it could have the potential, and again, these are just hypotheses, to increase overall participation. So actually having a tool that's perceived as being fair for selection of board members might motivate other people who traditionally feel that they could not win an election because maybe they're not such good public speakers, or they're very shy, or again, they belong to a group that's historically discriminated, like women and minorities. So this could motivate them actually to participate in such venues. And lastly, he says it could foster improved decision making. Again, similar to all the rest of the points, just because the decisions that are made actually reflect the views of everyone and not a smaller class. So in the end, you might have less decisions like closing the company or closing a factory, because that affects, again, a certain class within the firm negatively. Any questions on that? Okay. Moving on very quickly to Roy Ridley Duff. He's English, British, and works a lot in the cooperative sector in the UK. And recently he's written an interesting article on platform cooperatives and the social and solidarity economy. And if we have enough time, I would like to study the case studies that he emphasizes, or that he discusses in this paper. So he says basically that the traditional approach sees cooperatives, charities, and similar such institutions, maybe NGOs, as a third sector. That's to separate them from the private sector, the private economy, traditional firms, and the government, which is the second sector. And he says, however, they are present in all sectors of the economy, things like co-ops. So in fact, he says it's incorrect to call cooperatives a third sector. In fact, he says you could consider them even a fourth space, which is sort of between and betwixt. They serve some roles that governments serve. Sometimes they serve roles that the private market serves. And again, so there is suggested that it may be a mistake to sort of put them in their own ghetto, as some cooperatives are more, profit oriented, and some are less profit oriented, some are more environmentally oriented, and so on. So there are these different types that make it difficult to put them just in one category. So in terms of the digital economy, which is the focus of his paper, he says there are two phases of this economy. The first is the extractive model, the capitalist model, he says. The typical suspects, think about Amazon, think about Google, think about these types of firms, which have, again, this sort of extractivist model where, data is seen as this, similar to oil, as a raw material that can be processed and turned over into a profit. And then he says the second face of the digital economy is the post-capitalist commons. So again, coming back to Elinor Ostrom and her notion of the common resource pools. Actually, it should be not CPRI, but CRPI's Common Resource Pool Institutions. So he's drawing that term from what we read before from Elinor Ostrom. And in fact, he proposes the social and solidarity economy, or SSE, as the field of study, and social enterprise as basically the tools of transforming within this field. And in his paper, as I say, he has three case studies Kiva, Lumio, and Kickstarter, which all three sort of display or represent different aspects of this um, of this discourse. And again, if we have time, I would like to sort of separate into groups. I thought we would have six, so we'd have two for each case study, but we'll see if we can get to that. And then I think this is the last. No, second to last. There's the needs-based organization. This is again a paper, a very recent paper by Silvia Sacchetti and Ermanno Tortilla. We already saw their last paper on the public organization. Uh, Again, I'm a nepotist. I'm showing papers by my own friends. No, I think this is a very interesting paper. I just was in a conference with them discussing this paper. So again, they are moving away from the new institutional economics-based firm of people like Williamson and Huntsman. We've heard enough their names, so don't have to review their ideas. And in fact, they're looking at psychology. They're looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You might have heard this, one of the most famous psychologists of the 20th century, who basically described this pyramid of needs that every individual has, that starts with the basics, of survival, again, security, belonging, and then at higher and higher levels, we have more abstract needs, which include things like self-actualization, which again, we've heard that term before, and says that again, part of well-being relates to autonomy and this notion of self-determination or self-actualization. So in fact, they say all of these theories and psychological whatever models, in fact, relate to the theory of the firm. Uh, because again, people's needs don't suddenly change when they're at work. They still have a need for security and survival and belonging. They still have needs for self-actualization. And so again, these lower levels relate to the issues that relate to the firm as well as the higher levels. So uh, in the end, they conclude actually cooperatives can very well serve as tools consistent with these goals or this goal of self-actualization. Again, it's a question of what type of rationality we're applying or employing. Are we looking at profit maximization and shareholder value, or are we looking at the ability for organizations to facilitate or realize this notion of self-actualization? And again, they say this is increasingly important, and looking at things like depression and stress and similar issues uh, basically points the way to moving beyond this sole form or type of rationality. So this is the end. So getting now towards the basically the end of this workshop, I wanted to bring in some ideas from the Global South, and we have Ubuntu. I'm actually speaking to you from an Ubuntu system, so this is a type of Linux, but of course, this is not the origins of the word Ubuntu. They sort of borrowed the term. Ubuntu is an African term from Southern Africa. It's a bit loud here. There's a helicopter going by. I hope you can hear me. Um, it's an African term. It's used in Southern Africa and South Africa and other parts of Southern Africa as well, meaning something like humanness or humaneness. And again, thinking back about the very start of the workshop, this is a very interesting term as it relates to embedding, social embedding. So here we have a quote: while it envelops the key values of group solidarity, compassion, respect, human dignity, conformity to basic norms, and collective unity, in its fundamental sense, it denotes humanity and morality. Its spirit emphasizes respect for human dignity, marking a shift from confrontation to conciliation. The authors actually emphasize that it's not a communist philosophy in the sense that there's still a sense of individual property and the rights of the individual, and you might see this in different light. I'm just again representing the ideas of this chapter. They say actually, but on the other hand, what it means is that costs, costs in a particular situation or benefit and disadvantage are always weighed in relation to the needs of all parties. So, for instance, in a legal case, you're not just. So, anyway, I'll just read this. This is basically the example that I think will show what that means. They're referring to a case here of constitutional law, and it's a property dispute. And here they say, in sum, the Constitution, and they're talking about South Africa's Constitution, imposes new obligations. And again, this is the post apartheid Constitution, new obligations on the courts concerning rights relating to property not previously recognized by the common law. The common law, of course, is the British system, that uses precedents and so on. It counterposes to the normal ownership rights of possession, use, and occupation a new and equally relevant right not to arbitrarily be deprived of a home. The expectations that ordinarily go with title could clash head on with the genuine despair of people in dire need of accommodation. The judicial function in these circumstances is not to establish a hierarchical arrangement between the different interests involved, privileging in an abstract and mechanical way the rights of ownership over the right not to be dispossessed of a home or vice versa. Rather, it is to balance out and reconcile the opposed claims in as just a manner as possible, taking account of all the interests involved and the specific factors relevant in each particular case. So it's a very fine-grained philosophy. And again, they relate it as well to Kant's, Immanuel Kant, just a German philosopher in the 18th century, late 18th century. And he spoke of the categorical imperative, which connects freedom with moral duty. So, of course, Kant suggested that the freedom of the individual stops basically or is limited by its encroachment on the freedom of another individual. So again, it's this idea of embedding our own individual and our own individuality in a larger social context, and that context is being central vitality. Okay, and I think that is it. Yes.